The profound and wondrous Dharma is rarely encountered, even in 100 million kalpas. Having it to hear, accept, and maintain, may I taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning again. So this morning we have for me, the great joy of welcoming my Dharma teacher, Abbot Konjin Gaelyn Godwin. Thank you so much for being here. She requested that I would be brief in my introduction, but so I'll try. Abbot Gaelyn began practicing at San Francisco Zen Center maybe in the late 80s and received ordination in 1991 from Reb Anderson, Tenshin Reb Anderson. Corinne Charlie met Gaelyn in 93, maybe 92, 93. And I did in 1996, maybe 97. She was a sewing teacher. Then as I knew it, Gaelyn went to study in Hawaii. I think, does that sound right? Previous to that, she had Hoshinji in Japan as well. And then we all lived together at Tassajara for a number of years. And I had also the great joy of working in the physical plant under Gaelyn's leadership. So it was a great practice taking care of the physical plant at Tassajara. And then Gaelyn moved to Houston in, I think, 2001, 2003. There was a group there that had been going for a while, but in the time since Abbot Gaelyn's been there, the Houston Zen Center has grown to a thriving urban Zen center, an amazing place. If you're ever in Houston, please visit. And currently Gaelyn is so in addition to being the abbot of the Houston Zen Center, she's the director of the Soto Zen Buddhism International Center, Soto Zen Buddhism North America, and also is pursuing a master's degree. We're joined this morning by Reverend Taiga and Reverend Koyu. Welcome. I think you're both also from the Soto Zen Buddhism International Center. So wonderful to have all of you with us this morning. And thank you so much, dear teacher, for being here this morning.
It's really nice to see you all. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Reverend Sarah, Reverend Charlie, and Jisho Roshi. So good to see you too. It's really great. This non-traveling travel is really kind of miraculous. So happy to be here. Happy to be here with you. I can't quite see everybody on the same screen, but pretty close. Anyway, it's really great. I want to talk today about a couple of things, but I thought of titling the talk, Awake in a Nightmare. How's that? Although I'm not going to be talking so much about the nightmare, mostly I'm going to be talking about being awake. But I want to talk about action. The great translator and teacher Nishijima introduced one of the fascicles of Dogen Zenji, the one that's called Gyobutsu Yuigi. He introduced it by saying, Buddhism is a religion of action. And I think that was a very brave thing to say. The fascicle that he used that to introduce is called the active, what is it? It's dignified presence of active Buddhas, or awesome presence of active Buddhas. Kaz Tanahashi translates it as awesome, and Nishijima translated it as dignified, the dignified presence of active Buddhas. And action, which is the best word to use for the word karma. So action is the word for the karma of what we do. And then there's another word for the word of the results of that, which is vipaksha. But karma is definitely what Buddhas are up to. But they also are up to what we would understand as real action. So there, I like to say, Buddhas are always reaching out to us. Buddhas are always right there and reaching out to us. And our ability to feel that Buddha-shaped, us-shaped Buddha reaching out toward us and surrounding us is part of the beauty of our practice when we can feel that. So Buddhas are always reaching out to us. And in our teaching of Mahayana, the Buddha nature in us, since we all have that same Buddha nature, is always reaching out to us. It's always trying to express itself through us. So part of what we study when we study action is our awareness of that action and our response to it. You know, the great Bodhisattva John Lewis just passed away, and his action over the years, if we study it, his action, his interpretation of the world he lived in, his understanding of the meaning of all of his actions is really beautiful and inspiring. So that's part of the meaning of active Buddhas too, the dignified behavior of active Buddhas. We can be inspired by them when we identify them in our lives. Other things that are action are, oh goody, I'm sorry. I rescued a fledgling white-winged dove last night, and right behind this computer is my little enclosed bamboo garden, which is now even more enclosed to keep the temple cat from getting in there. And it's one of those stories, if you're not sure if you're doing the right thing, you're not supposed to kidnap fledglings and take them to the wild animal shelter. You're supposed to wait for the mom to come back. And she didn't come back last night, so I hung a nest in the bamboo. And then this morning she was back. And they've been sitting, and I had left a ladder out there to attach the nest. And I thought, well, it'd be nice to put the ladder away, but they're using the ladder as flight training. And now the mother has come back and she's grooming the little baby. Just saying, you never know the fruits of your actions. Okay, it's not going to distract me. The cat is being very cool about it too. So there's action like that, but other action involved in that very same action are actions of our mind, like hope is an action. Trust is an action. Of course, compassion is an action. Kindness is an action. These are actions. Kindness and compassion are easy to understand in that two-part way. Something's happening in the mind, but we see it in the body. Trust, hope, joy, sympathetic joy aren't necessarily translated into action out there in the world, but they are actions. Just as we can encourage each other to act in the world, we can encourage each other to act in this mind. So part of what John Lewis liked to say was that democracy is an action. It's not a state. It's not a constant permanent state. What Buddhas understand about action and all their subtle actions, what awakened beings understand about action, is where they're located in it. So the dignified bearing of an active Buddha is the bearing of a being who understands that they're in a field. One of those authors of the many books, I'll say something about our own racial justice work that we're doing, but one of those authors, I think it's the Robin DiAngelo book, she refers to habitus, she refers to the surround that that kind of determines the meaning of an action. And Buddhas are really aware of that surround. In fact, every movement that they make, including the thought movements like hope and trust and so on, has a ripple throughout the whole field. The same is true of us. Buddhas understand it though, that the field of action goes all 10 directions and all 3 times. changing the meaning, influencing the meaning of the past, which then radiates back out into the future. So I do actually like the Nishijima translation of that fascicle, dignified bearing, dignified behavior of dignified behavior of active Buddhas instead of awesome behavior of active Buddhas, because John Lewis was so dignified. I was appreciating that more, and when I was reflecting on John Lewis, and I was appreciating that more when I reflect on our particular tradition of Soto Zen, which works to, has the effect of shaping these dignified bodies. Maybe it's just because we all live together in these crowded monastic situations, but the result is a bunch of dignified behavior, also playful and joyous and loving, but a Buddha aware of the significance of every single gesture, every single lifting of the eyebrows, meaning and the consequences of all of those. It kind of results in a dignified bearing. Same with John Lewis. So, you know, I do live in the South, where I have now lived for, let's see, I moved here on September 6th, 2003, so it's almost 17 years. We're having our racial justice effort. And we had a meeting yesterday. So I know you guys are very active in it. In fact, I've made use of some of the materials you've collected, and many of the materials that are on our reading list for the future are from your website. So thank you very much for that. The majority of the people in our Unpacking Whiteness group are actual Southerners. Alabama, Louisiana, many from Texas, South Carolina, people, multi-generational Southerners. And we had a very moving meeting yesterday. We're on the fourth class of this study. And the Southerners, who are very, you know, these are very liberal people. It's a very liberal town and very professional group of people and so on. But several of them had a hard time yesterday understanding, really, one of them said, I didn't know the meaning of these things. I didn't know what Selma meant. My daughter told me to watch this, he said. I didn't know what it meant. We weren't told this, none of us. And none of the Southerners, I shouldn't say none, most of the Southerners have really been kept that the history of this particular geographical area has been kept from them. And watching them come to terms with it was very moving. One of the women said, and you know, picture pretty strong Southern accents saying these things and coping with this. She said, I had no idea that people could do that. We'd just been shown a film of a crowd at a lynching. I had no idea, she said. I just despair of human nature. What can I do? I just feel hopeless. So also they have to deal with their families who are less far along than they are in many cases. So they have to hear those words, but don't you think that all lives matter? And then the nuanced vocabulary that they now have to learn with their families is, they're working really hard at that interface. One of the things I'm really interested in these days, underneath the kind of seething anger around and the bizarre acts of violence, is the harm that's caused from feeling unworthy. So the feeling of unworthiness that lies underneath a lot of misbehavior is really interesting and important to look at. When I love the Lotus Sutra, and one of the stories, actually a few of the stories in the Lotus Sutra are directly about the feeling of unworthiness and how Buddhas and Bodhisattvas should help people recover from feelings of unworthiness and turn around and accept this Buddha nature that's blossoming within them. And one of the big mysteries is people will try to turn away. So people will act against their own goodness. So the Lotus Sutra's teaching, one of them is that the wandering son, sometimes I say daughter, sometimes I say they, whatever works. So this son, this daughter, this child wandered away and forgot their true home. Many, many years passed. Lotus Sutra has a big sense of time. Decades passed, but while they forgot their home, the parents never forgot them. So obvious parallel with the Buddha. We forget, Buddha never forgets. Awakened nature never forgets, but we do, humans do forget. And then the story is how the Bodhisattva, in the shape of this child's parents, diligently adapted to the conditions and meticulously, in a very careful and thoughtful way, worked to reconnect with the child, restore the child's sense of worthiness, and bring the child back to understanding that they had a treasure store waiting for them that was ready to open up. Dogen Zenji does refer to this story pretty often. Even at the end of the Fukan Zazengi, your treasure store will open of itself and you will use it at will. But there's this action that's happening to bring us back into that sense of connection. I also feel that it really is one of the keys to understanding a very famous story of our lineage in which Bodhidharma brings Zen from India to China and has a little dialogue with an emperor who wants to know, I've done all these things, I've built monasteries and temples, and what is the value of what I've done? And Bodhidharma says, no merit. And then there are a few other sentences that they engage in. And then Bodhidharma goes off and sits in a cave and faces a wall for 9 years. It's a foundational story in Zen. But when I was looking at it again through this lens of the power of the feeling of unworthiness, I thought even that emperor felt unworthy and needed validation from a great teacher, Bodhidharma, but he couldn't feel it for himself. He needed Bodhidharma to say, what you've done is great, you're a good person, everything's fine. And Bodhidharma couldn't do it because it isn't in the works that our value resides, it's already here. This treasure store is already here. And then we act from that. But the emperor wanted to be assured that there was something in those actions that could, increase his own sense of worth. To his credit, the emperor did not punish Bodhidharma for being disrespectful. I like that part of the story, actually, because emperors of China were very, very, very powerful. So he could have just had Bodhidharma locked up or murdered or whatever, but Bodhidharma went off and sat in a cave, and we honor that cave sitting to this day. This sense of worthiness, and our kind of nightmare political situation, especially in the South, not really, this is equally shared across the whole planet. Watching the eruption of fairly primal fears and rages and distrust and incredible lies and deception, watching that as it did for our member in the class yesterday, a source of hopelessness and despair. How are we going to deal with this? I decided to reread a book. A friend of mine wrote a book many years ago called Awake in a Nightmare, which is why I thought of calling this talk Awake in a Nightmare. I think a number of you are in my generation, and you probably remember the People's Temple and Jim Jones. Some of you do. Because sometimes now, when people say, they talk about deception and they say, oh, so-and-so drank the Kool-Aid, meaning so-and-so was, drank the Kool-Aid and is now in delusion, or so-and-so was so deluded they drank the Kool-Aid. Well, the drinking of the Kool-Aid happened at that time. And my friend who wrote this book actually interviewed some of the people who didn't drink the Kool-Aid. So I get some sort of cred for being able to say, I actually met somebody who did not drink the Kool-Aid. I met 2 of them. And this is a story of something quite similar as I was reading it, because these are people, there were several thousand people in LA and San Francisco who in the 70s. So some of you don't remember this, you can't remember this, but it was in late 60s and early 70s, and this very wonderful, extroverted, charismatic preacher named Jim Jones was going around creating temples, and he had a large following in LA, huge following in San Francisco, and in Redwood City. Is it Redwood City that's up where you guys are, or Redwood Valley? City? No, anyway, it's that Redwood thing up there. And he had a large compound up there, and thousands of people lived there, black and white, and did good works, very powerful in San Francisco politics. He was considered a very important influence. If you got Jim Jones' support, then you would get 7,000 votes at least. And people were so hungry for home and so hungry to trust that when he said, trust me, they trusted him. And when he said, these other people are completely wrong, they cleaved to him. So they began to believe that he was right, the only one who could actually see what was going on. Everybody else was lying to them. And therefore, as he got increasingly paranoid and bizarre, not dignified in his behavior, they decided to move to a safer place. So they moved to Guyana, which is right next to Venezuela. So we got bus loads of them and then plane loads of them, and they moved to Guyana. But his behavior never changed, or didn't change. His behavior did indeed change. It got worse. And he did these sort of trials to test people's allegiance to him. He would say, this is poison, you drink it. And then people would drink the stuff and not die, because it was just a test of loyalty. But then as he got increasingly paranoid, he did make up a batch of poisoned Kool-Aid, and everybody in the compound, except a few who escaped, drank that Kool-Aid. So when people say somebody didn't drink the Kool-Aid, they're actually referring to something incredibly horrifying. And if you were living in the Bay Area at that time, it was just one of the saddest things, because people hoped that that person represented a new way of black and white people all living together and sharing everything communally. But his delusion made it impossible. So the person that my friend interviewed and wrote this really good book about, the only first person survivor of Jonestown book, said that he knew immediately that Jim Jones was a con man, because he himself was a con man. So he recognized a con, but it didn't matter so much, because he was getting what he wanted. He was living with friends, getting fed, being safe. So he even knew that it was a lie, but he chose to do it because it answered some need in him. For me, the parallels with some of the belief that's happening in the South for the current Jim Jones huckster are kind of amazing. So are we hopeless? No, because we have to know the backstories. We have to know the backstories of all these Southern street names. We have to know the backstories of everything that's happened here in the South and in the West and in the North. We have to know the backstory of a simple phrase like so-and-so drank the Kool-Aid. It's good to know what that actually is referring to. But it's also really good for me to know the power of action. So when we turn our minds to our own minds, we are acting. And Thich Nhat Hanh, I really appreciate Thich Nhat Hanh all the time. And his simple phrase of what seeds are you going to water is so powerful. It describes the whole thing. What seeds are we going to water? And in the Abhidharma teachings about how the mind works, it's a little more intricate and a little more, what would you call it? Detailed, but it's the same process. The power of our minds to attend to something like hope, something like compassion, something like trust, the power of our minds to attend to that are powerful actions. And somebody like John Lewis, who chose to do it even in the face of brutality, he chose what he was going to be, how he was going to interpret his situation. That's a powerful bodhisattva action. So awake in a nightmare is what the subject of Ethan's book chose to call his experience when he was in Jonestown in Guyana. But there's something similar to what I feel sometimes day to day when I'm outside and nobody's out there wearing a mask except me. But I'd rather be awake. I'd really rather be awake. And I want to be awake in a sense that even the nightmare has things to tell us about what's going on. And I'm sorry, that little bird out there is preening. That little bird that we rescued is just so happy right now. And mom is preening. Happy story. We'll see. The cat barrier is very effective. The power of these wholesome actions ripples through the whole continuum of space and time. One thing to say about John Lewis's actions is that they're beautiful. They're beautiful. A good action, an action of courtesy and kindness is beautiful. And when I thought about that, that gave me an image of this poem. When I was running a lot, Sarah and I also share that. We both really like running. And when I was running a lot in San Francisco, when I lived there, I would memorize sonnets and poems. And this is one of the poems that I memorized, but I don't have it memorized anymore. But I want to read it to you, even though it's very old-fashioned, but it has to do with this power of beautiful action. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us and asleep, full of sweet dreams and health and quiet breathing. Therefore, on every morrow are we wreathing a flowery band to bind us to the earth. Spite of despondence, of the inhuman dearth of noble natures, of the gloomy days, of all the unhealthy and o'er-darkened ways made for our searching, Yes, in spite of all, some shape of beauty moves away the pall from our dark spirits. Such the sun, the moon, trees old and young, sprouting a shady boon for simple sheep. And such are daffodils with the green world they live in, and clear rills that for themselves a cooling covert make against the hot season. The mid-forest brake, rich with a sprinkling of fair musk rose blooms, and such too is the grandeur of the dooms we have imagined for the mighty dead. All lovely tales that we have heard or read, an endless fountain of immortal drink pouring unto us from the heavens' brink. Nor do we merely feel these essences for one short hour. No, even as the trees that whisper round a temple become soon dear as the temple's self, so does the moon. The passion poesy, glories infinite, haunt us till they become a cheering light unto our souls and bound to us so fast that whether there be shine or gloom or cast, they always must be with us or we die. I never thought I would read John Keats in a Dharma talk, but it came and you have it now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we welcome, so people can just unmute. Ken, does that work for you? Yeah. Okay. So if you have questions or comments, please go ahead and just unmute. Can I share a quick story?
Be careful or I will share a quick story too.
When you were talking about the value of being awake, you know, even in the pain of, even to the pain of the nightmare, this is for me a foundational story in my relationship with Gaelyn was, I was sewing a rakusu. I was given permission to sew a rakusu, and I was doing it hastily somewhat because there were 3 weeks until the ceremony, and Reverend Blanche Hartman was mad about this actually. And Gaelyn would come over to City Center from Green Gulch to help teach the sewing. And I was fairly overwhelmed by the process, even though now I'm a sewing teacher. I was completely clueless, but my friends were all helping me, and I just felt like, okay, all I have to do is this little section and that's it. And I was really taking comfort in that, because if I tried to think of the big picture, I would get overwhelmed. And someone said, well, what do you do next? And I said, I don't know, but ignorance is bliss. And from across a fairly crowded and chatty room, Gaelyn said, don't say that. And I was startled awake. And I remember also feeling I was a little scared. But I also remember what stuck with me was the care in that you from across the room was like, ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is not what we're doing here. And so I eventually devoted myself to learning sewing. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I did go to San Francisco Zen Center to work with Blanche, and I did help with the sewing, but the reason I went there from Green Gulch every week was actually to learn from Blanche. That's why I went. So I asked her if I could come. I was already teaching sewing at Green Gulch, but I asked her if I could come and learn her way. And a lot of what I learned from her was that care. And also the fact that she could pay attention to 10,000 things at one time. You thought all she was doing was sitting there.
Thank you for your talk. I'm so thrilled that you talked about John Lewis. I spent hours watching his funeral the other day, different services through the week, and am old enough to, been swept up by Selman from Boston, going there to march and having it be really a changing phenomenon for me. And just gaining more and more respect for the guts of John Lewis and others, facing so much violence with nonviolence. And I grew to appreciate it more as the years went on, what courage was involved. And then in his life, in the description of who he was that I knew, less about. I mean, just this courage wrapped up in so much humility and kindness and big vision and staying the course over so many years, even when the course seems to, like so many of us are feeling, golly, didn't we do this already? Or, why are we here again? And to know that he was, never gave up in taking a step forward and moving forward. Anyway, thank you for appreciating and calling out all of his bodhisattva qualities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, for rounding it out. So I think his influence will grow. Thank you. The fact that he prepared basically his own obituary, he prepared something to be printed after he died, was amazing, and named names that we're all trying to honor, otherwise they would be forgotten. So very beautiful act.
Gaelyn, thank you so much for your talk. I greatly enjoyed it. And I'd love to hear you say, I mean, one of the things that was powerful for me is you talked about how thoughts are actions, or our intention is actions. Because I find at this stage in my life that not taking action and reflection is often the better part of what I have to contribute. In addition to being a white male, my father was a pretty high-ranking military officer. So I don't find it difficult to step into action or lean forward sometimes. But I've seen more and more when that's it's coming from a place of not worthiness. Let me put it that way. So I'd love it if you would just talk a little bit more about that and your thoughts on it.
Well, the two things that came to my mind, one is the really subtle part of it, which is the way we work in our minds is very subtle. And the choice to not do what we've defined as action, to not do a thing, is itself an action. And that often is the wiser thing. My little white-winged dove out there, I held off on taking it to the wildlife refuge, waiting for the mom to return. So there was a choice to not act that was an action. So everything that we do is an action. And I think that part of what we're learning is, at least what I'm learning, is how to appreciate that. So me not speaking up is an action. Me speaking up is an action. Me saying it this way is an action. And all of the surround inside your mind in that subtle territory is part of what you can act on. So I'm really glad that you brought up the more gross thing, which is this feeling of unworthiness. And that can be part of the habitat. I think it is part of the habitat of a consciousness, so that everything has that flavor, or action is being determined in that flavor of unworthiness. I really think it fuels a lot of anger. People have, not that I'm saying this about you, this is just now a tangential thought, but people have often said that there aren't very many Buddhist sutras about anger. But if you look, there are a lot of Buddhist sutras about unworthiness. So I think the insight of the Buddha was that that was more basic than displays of anger. So anger is kind of easy from a Buddhist point of view, but the feeling of unworthiness is harder to get to. For us in our time, or in our situation, how do you feel when somebody says, you know, the Buddha is reaching out for you and surrounding you with love? Can you relax into that? Hard for us in our time. And yet it's true. And that's what the, the cure is, that we recognize we're in this field. We're not an isolated person, because an isolated person doesn't exist. But if we can open up to the fact that we're surrounding each other, we're living in this field of love, coursing through us and between us and among us all the time, then we have ways to relate and find wholesome action. John Lewis, acted in a whole field of people that he influenced. So unworthiness and a sense of self kind of go hand in hand, don't you think? Maybe. How was that? Did that address it?
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate your thoughts on that, and I agree with what you said about anger. And I have the anger, but I can feel that it's much, the unworthiness thing is much more deep seated.
Yeah.
More primary. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that part of the anger now in the world comes from the fact that all the efforts we've made to sequester the feeling of unworthiness and legislate where it belongs are breaking down. So in the South, it was just legislated. People who were Black went in those doors, drank from those water fountains. People were talking about that yesterday because they grew up in times like that was the case. And all that legislation about who's worthy and who's not has really crumbled. And the borders that people are trying to put up to keep the unworthy out so that the worthy can be in here. And then they find they still feel unworthy. It's just enraging, I think, for people. My theory. But thank you. Thank you for courageously defining yourself as a white man. My group is not quite ready to do that. It's very hard for them. Thank you. I'm looking at the waffle of your faces. I see Peggy Denial. Oh, and you unmuted. Hi, Peggy.
Yes. Hi, Gaelyn. What you just said, I'm really moved by it, about the anger and unworthiness, and to look just as you were saying, and I'm looking underneath this anger that I feel, it really is a feeling of unworthiness. And it never occurred to me. I mean, there's a lot I've thought about what brings up anger, but it did not occur to me that it was unworthiness.
Well, thank you for saying that. And now I encourage you, because I've been doing it too, is to wake up to all the times when that feeling kind of sneaks in.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And then kind of observe your coping strategies. It's really interesting because it's actually happening quite a lot, because an isolated self is kind of unworthy. It's prone to it. So.
And it's a different way to cope with it if you think of it as unworthy than thinking of it as anger.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My pleasure. How is Michael?
He's good. He's normally here, but it's his birthday today, and his son is talking to him on the phone. And
Happy
that's the most important thing.
Great.
Gaelyn, thank you so
Yes.
much for your incredible talk. I love talks that feature living bodhisattvas, and John Lewis's case recently passed. But I love the reference point that it's not a disembodied black and white type on a page. It's real people who are doing real things. What do you think, and what do you have to say about this whole business of trying to convince others? The whole issue, I really appreciate your discussion of action, and I love the hope and trust your actions. That just makes me feel wonderful. I'm finding myself, and I don't think I'm alone, and I'm kind of disturbed by it. I'm trying to convince people. I'm trying to convince people of things. And I'm so scared and upset about like the election coming up. I used to be silent. I used to refrain. It definitely, like Barry said, felt like the wiser thing to do. I can't stop myself. It's like I'm just trying to convince people that they need facts to make, and science and all that. I mean, I won't go on. I'm preaching to the choir here, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that, because it's both upsetting and out of control for me.
Probably you should give a Dharma talk. That's all we're doing, is trying to convince people, but we're invited to do it. So, or teach a class and invite people to come. I don't think, it's part of it's the habitat that you're in. What's the context I'm in? How am I going to experiment with the context I'm in? And certain things you might feel okay about saying, certain things you don't, but put yourself in different habitats and experiment. It's definitely okay to try to convince people, depending on the context. Right? I never try with my grandchildren. Forget it.
Right. Okay. Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
But then you get to try to convince people by your behavior. And then we become sort of devious bodhisattvas. It's like, oh, wow, I just learned something new. I didn't know that the name of something referred to a civil rights action, and there are all sorts of devious ways to influence people, and very respectful. So does that help?
Enormously.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
I convinced you. Thank you.
You sure did. Thank you.
Do you pronounce your name Judy or Jude?
Jude, just for the
Jude.
just Jude.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I was going to say, I have something for you, Jude, that I just got that I can always hook up with you or anybody else. It's my new T-shirt.
Great. Great.
Gaelyn, thank you so much for your talk. I really, really appreciate it. And what I have to say is a commentary on what Jude just said. And I've often really thought about that, Jude. And, you know, anywhere from Trump supporters to the fundamentalists, that's an issue I think that we all face, especially when there's so much difference. And from my experience, sometimes when the boundaries are so rigid, where I start is just from not even convincing. It's really just from listening and understanding. Because sometimes they can't even move an inch or a centimeter away. So all you can do is move to where they are. And from there, you know, and I feel like I have to start there and then inch my way with utmost respect and only what they can even handle. And some people might not be able to handle much. So that's kind of like, I don't know if that makes sense, but with the people I am with, that seems to, even if I can't convince much, maybe there's no convincing, but at least there's some sort of harmony to start with. I don't know.
Yeah.
Great point, Vicki.
Thank you.
I wanted to share an experience that I had recently. And thank you so much for your talk, Gaelyn. There was a subcontractor, managing a building project, and he had a sticker on the back of his truck that said "Black Rifles Matter." And Vicki and I and a few other people have discussed this previously. And he reached out to me to see if I'd hired anybody to do that job yet. He hadn't actually given me a bid. And I said to him, I said, you know, I'm going to bring something up, and this is very uncomfortable for me. I don't know how you're going to feel about it, but what's up with Black Rifles Matter on the back of your truck? And he said it was about the Second Amendment. And I made a comment about, rifles. I didn't even talk about anything else. And he said, "Oh, you want to get political?" And he hung up on me. And so, I'm okay. I was a little fearful because, if somebody's that into guns, I don't know what they want to do to people that aren't into guns, right? But I felt like I needed to at least bring it up. And I had no intention of hiring unless he had a really good answer, which I don't think he was going to come up with. But it was kind of frightening, but it felt important to do. And that's it. And so I think for me, that's one, we can't maybe change people's minds, but we can label things or call things out in a way that's a different way than they look at it. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. And that is brave to speak, to ask about it. That's really good. I'm glad. And people are so sensitive. There he was, sensitive to being disrespected. So such low confidence. I have a little story. The last time I was in Chicago, I updated my Chicago Cubs hat. Charlie, I got a new one. And it was really cute because, I run a lot and so I sweat through them. So this is a new one. It had a nice little cubby and a C and very, very nice hat. And it was unusual when I bought it at the airport. It's bright red. I thought, wow, I've never seen a bright red one. And so I got back to Houston and I was wearing it, and the emblem, the kind of logo is kind of blue and white and red. And so you have this red hat. And people in my neighborhood, which is it's pretty politically it's all one democratic thing. It's gerrymandered anyway. And people were looking at me in a rude way. I felt it, and I didn't know why. Am I walking my dog wrong? You know, am I dressed wrong? And then when I got home, I realized it looks like a Trump hat. So I can't wear that hat anymore. But I felt the actual bad feeling coming at me. So we radiate those feelings out, you know, even if we don't think so. I had no idea that they were radiating something at me because of my hat, but they were radiating something at me. So we feel each other's disrespect or respect and kindness at an animal level. Can't wear that hat though. Or I won't wear that hat. So John Lewis was one of those people who had such deep faith in something. I really was impressed in his the editorial that he left, or the article that he left. He did not play the Christian card at all. It doesn't refer to God. He remained sensitive about the diversity of religions in our country. I really respected that, because I live in a world where the Christian card is played all the time. And his faith in something that he would call one thing and I would call another was so strong that he just radiated out this confidence and kindness to people. That's a bodhisattva.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to make a comment regarding David's comment and talking to that fellow about the Black Lives Matter. And I have finished reading a book where the person who wrote it said that making comments like that, or trying to express yourself in this day and age, takes skill. And it's like you have to learn through mistakes how to bring things up without, you know, offending people, or, you know, bringing it out in a thoughtful way rather than an unskillful way. So.
Thank you. So we'll do the closing chant. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are infinite. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is boundless. I vow to realize it.
Thank you all. It's lovely to see you. Take care.